I want to welcome everybody to the first Life-Saving Award, recognizing members of the St. Paul Police Department. Now, it's said that success has many mothers and that failure is an orphan. And before we get started, I really need to recognize somebody who didn't make it here today, but I think really needs to be noted for his accomplishment. The Life-Saving Award really is the product of two people. Retired Inspector Pete Bravo really is the father of this award. Way back in the day when Andy Haru, the Cabana boy, got his Medal of Valor for saving a bunch of Hmong families out of a burning building, Pete Bravo came up to me and said, "You know, boss, Andy's award was outstanding and his accomplishments were truly, truly great. But I need you to know, there are as many good cops out there that do the same thing every day that just never get recognized." And from that conversation, we began looking at why, given our commitment to life, we weren't recognizing that as a separate category of activity. And out of those conversations, Pete's relentless. For those of you that know him, he's now retired, but he is absolutely relentless. He would not let that concept go. And along the way, he pulled in Julia Rust, who was then in personnel or human resources, and together they tag teamed me basically, designed a process, created what I think is the most beautiful medal I've ever seen. And today's celebration is really a testimonial to perseverance and persistence by good staff people. Pete told me that far from being the only story of compassion and courage under fire, that St. Paul really, truly does have so many more stories than that. Now, I will tell you that I believe that we have dumbed down what we think of as compassion and courage. In our overly psychoanalytic world today, we get people who, by bearing their souls on TV to Dr. Phil, are said to have expressed courage. And then this last week, I just came back from a school where the big topic was compassion fatigue, and where compassion was all about listening to people talk about how bad they felt about themselves. In the St. Paul Police Department, courage and compassion mean something. They mean far more than just words on a page. They mean far more than just people complaining. They are what St. Paul cops do every day. They express that basic belief. Now, where does it come from? I don't know. It's strength of character. It's walking in the face of your fears and thinking more of the other person's welfare than thinking about your own self-interest. I think that's where this comes from. It's an answer to a question that I ask a lot at community meetings. I ask people, am I my brother's keeper? Am I my sister's keeper? And to a person, every St. Paul cop that's being honored today has answered in the affirmative. They have stepped up, put themselves into the breach, put themselves in harm's way so that someone else could live. That, I think, speaks volumes about their commitment to this community. Now, in looking at today's award winners, there are 25 officers here today to be recognized. 25 officers who took decisive action when they could have stepped off, when they could have waited for somebody else to do something, who did not make that choice. 5 of these officers are legacy officers, and I make a big deal about legacy officers at graduation. They are officers who come from other St. Paul cops. And at this moment, I'd like the dads of the St. Paul cops being honored today to stand and be recognized, because you produced a hell of a guy. Let's give him a hand. I'm guessing their parents, many of which Charlie Anderson and others, Mike McGinn, were my bosses when I came on the job. And some of the younger ones like Lino and Ficadenti, I got about as proud as I am of these young men and women. So, in some of these cases, the officers responded alone. And in some cases, they were part of a bigger team. And in one case that we'll talk about today, one of the officers has done this twice. I think that's just amazing. The first award winners are notable because they intervened in a critical moment in the lives of some of our community's most vulnerable, the mentally ill. want you to ask yourself, how do you measure the self-sacrifice it takes to step out onto the ledge to try and stop a person who, in their quest for self-destruction, sees you only as an impediment? These officers have been asked that question, and they have answered and been measured, and they have come through that with their integrity and the life of another's when it was hanging in the balance. We're going to start out with Officers Anthony Holte and John Thomas. You want to come up front? On September 28, 2006, Officers Holte and Thomas were called to the area of Wabasha and Kellogg on a woman about to jump from the ledge near the old adult detention center. They found the woman on a ledge that overlooked a parking lot, approximately 200 feet to the ground. She was upset, she was crying, talking on her cell phone. She was on that part of the ledge where there was no railing to protect her from falling. Both officers tried to communicate with her. Both tried to get her to talk to them, but she refused to respond. And realizing that she was just about to jump, they climbed over that rail, made their way out on the skinny edge. And while she was distracted momentarily, they grabbed her and physically had to fight with her to force her back against the railing. And ultimately, they were able to bring her back inside the building and to safety. It is with great pride that we award the Life-Saving Award, and he's over here now, to a late Anthony Holte and John Thomas. Let's give him a hand. Our next honoree, retired Officer Michael J. Johnson. Mike, come on up. On September 29, 2006, Officer Mike Johnson responded to a suicide in progress on McAfee Street. Officer Johnson found a man inside the house. The man had been drinking and was armed with a shotgun. The man had told him that he was going to shoot himself. And Officer Johnson spoke to him. And for those of you who know that Mike Johnson calmly is the only way Mike Johnson's ever approached this job. So the understanding that it had to be a calm conversation was just, that's in Mike's personality. He tried to de-escalate the situation. Other officers came. They were able to distract the party momentarily by standing on a planter. And when that moment came, despite the fact this man was armed with a shotgun, despite the fact that he could have taken out Officer Johnson and himself, Officer Johnson acted. Leaped on the guy, grabbed him, disarmed him, was able to keep him safe until the backup arrived and get him to the hospital so that he could be treated for his depression. It's with great honor that we recognize today the accomplishments of Officer Michael J. Johnson, now retired. Here's one of those teamwork awards I talked about. But Officer Mike McGinn, Francisco Molina, John Corcoran, and Gerald Carter come forward. On January 8, 2008, Officers McGinn, Corcoran, and Carter responded to a call for help at the Wabasha Street Bridge. There they found a man standing on a narrow, icy ledge, holding onto a wire with one hand until Officer Frank Molina showed up. Officer Molina engaged him in conversation, but the man was distraught. He made it very, very clear that his intention was to jump. Officer Molina edged closer and closer to the man, continuing to engage him in conversation. And literally, as he got within arm's reach of him, Molina was able to grab the man's arm, and at that time, McGinn, Corcoran, and Carter leaped into the fray, grabbing him, bringing him back over the rail. So it is with great pleasure and pride we recognize Officers Mike McGinn, Francis Molina, John Corcoran, and Gerald Carter for their actions. Another of our teams, with Officers David Quast, James McKnight, Charlie Anderson, and Matt Sweeney, come forward. On June 7, 2008, officers responded to a suicidal male threatening to jump, this time from the high bridge. Officers engaged in conversation with the distraught individual who was standing on the outside ledge of the bridge. For those of you that have just driven over the high bridge and have never walked on it, east to west, some of us have been punishment, said, you should know that that ledge there is a scant 6 inches wide. You think about how long your foot is, and think about just how close to toppling off of that bridge you are if you're standing on that ledge. The officers were able to, by talking to this individual, able to get within about an arm's length of him. But the guy recognized that this team was there to try and stop him from his self-destructive intent. Holding on literally by one arm, he began swinging at the officers, literally fighting with the officers to keep them from getting any closer. But despite his attempts to beat them off, the officers persevered, hung in there, absorbed the blows, didn't retreat, grabbed his arm, pulled him over the railing. And this guy sounds like a giant in the description I got. It took every bit of all these officers' strength to pull him over the railing, and even then, he continued to fight with them, trying to get away so that he could complete his attempt. He continued to fight with them, punching officers in the face and swinging at others. Despite all of that, they hung in there, took him to the ground, contained him, and got him to the hospital where he needed his help, got the help he needed. With great pride, we recognize Officers David Quast, Officer James McKnight, Charles Anderson, and Matt Sweeney for saving life today. Officer William Badette, Amy Boyer, Kathleen O'Reilly, Ed Dion, Jesse Molnar, please come forward. On May 25th, 2008, officers responded to a suicide in progress call. When they arrived, they found a distraught female holding a knife to her chest. She appeared to have already cut herself as there were blood on her legs, hands, and clothing. Those of you that are cops know that our training is to never get within 21 feet of a person that's armed with a knife. That's a gun day typically, and officers are trained to stay behind cover and not engage physically with armed individuals who have edged weapons. 21 feet is that safety margin that we talk about in the Tooler drill. But the officers recognized that this woman's intent was less homicidal than it was suicidal. They tried numerous times to convince the troubled woman to drop the knife. She refused and refused and refused, becoming angrier and angrier, implying more and more pressure towards the knife. The officers created a very quick plan. One officer was going to try and distract the woman, while the other officers continued to talk to her. Another officer waited for that crucial moment, that moment of opportunity when the knife was no longer pointed at her chest. And when that moment came, they used their tasers, they used their training, they used their quickness of mind to quickly move in, take her to the ground, handcuff her, and secure her so that she was no longer a threat to herself or any of the other officers. They did this so that she could live. And in doing so, they did this in a way that none of the officers had any wounds or any injuries inflicted on them, and she was saved so that she could go to the hospital and receive treatment. It's great pride. We recognize Officers Billy Badette, Amy Boyer, Kathleen O'Reilly, Ed Dion, and Jesse Molnar. St. Paul is very justly proud of our K-9 unit. And while most of us think of the K-9 unit as the unit that goes out there and apprehends the bad guys, sends the dogs into hazardous situation, tracks for weapons and other items, clearly our K-9 officers are truly much more than that. Would Officer John Buckmeyer, Pat Murphy, and Jeremy Ryan please come forward? On December 12, 2008, K-9 officers Buckmeyer, Murphy, and Ryan responded to a request for assistance on a suicidal woman who had jumped into the Mississippi River near Jackson and Warner Road. They were the first to arrive. Seeing the woman in the water, they had to create a plan quickly. Tied their dog leash together, they used them as a rope to literally lasso the distraught woman. They calmly gave instructions to her to tie the long leads around her so that she would not drift away or go underwater. Officers held onto the leads until St. Paul Fire arrived to further assist. Now, while that in and of itself would be heroic, the quickness of mind, the quick decision making, I want you to remember when this was. December 12th, 2008. Think about what the temperature was like that day. Think what it's like to get wet and have to lay there in the water in freezing cold temperatures, holding onto that lead, holding onto that leash. Keep talking to this person so that she doesn't drift off from hypothermia. This is courage above and beyond the call of duty. And we are very, very proud to award John Buckmeyer, Pat Murphy, and Jeremy Ryan the Life Saving Award. Sergeant Kevin Moore, come on down. Now, Kevin, as most of you know, is a world-renowned community policing expert. And you don't oftentimes connect community policing with life-saving, but Kevin Moore is versatile if he's nothing else. On March 23rd, Sergeant Moore encountered a woman standing on the outer edge, the railing of that high bridge again. She'd been there for several minutes, clearly contemplating suicide by jumping in the river. She talked to Kevin about her marital problems, about financial problems, problems we all can relate to. Sergeant Moore called for assistance, but assistance was slow in coming. And Kevin, not being the patient type, got out of his car, continued to approach the woman slowly, not wanting to spook her into some precipitous action. And eventually, all that community policing that Kevin works through so steadily with the Latino gangs that he investigates came into play as he smooth-talked her right back over that railing and onto the dry ground. He secured her, held her there until help could arrive. And this is not a uniformed cop. This is a detective who stepped out of his role, didn't just wait for the uniforms to roll in. He knew what he had to do, and he took decisive action that saved a life. Sergeant Kevin Moore. The next three cases I'm going to talk about recognize acts where officers threw themselves literally into the breach, threw themselves into harm's way. Not that the officers who took care of the suicidal parties were not just as in jeopardy, but these are situations where literally the chances of the officers being injured or killed were so extreme that it's not just a matter of compassion, it is not just a matter of chance, it really is a matter of damn good luck as much as anything else. That they did this not for their partners, not for other members of the department, but for total strangers, I think really makes it truly outstanding. Would Officers Jeffrey Lewis and Chris McGuire come forward? On October 24, 2006, Officers Lewis and McGuire responded to a suspicious call relating to a possible fire on Birmingham Street. Comments on the call indicated the caller initially heard a smoke alarm coming from their neighbor's residence. Upon their arrival, they observed smoke coming from a fourplex. After knocking on doors, they were able to evacuate 3 of the units immediately. And when no one answered at the 4th unit, they kicked in the door and yelled into the heavily smoke-filled room. From inside that smoke-filled room, so little visibility they couldn't see anything inside. They could hear a voice, though. And they told him to try and follow the light of their flashlights. But the smoke's too thick. His eyes are burning too bad from the smoke he's already taken in. He couldn't see the light. And so Officer McGuire made the decision that they had to go in and get this guy out. Crawling on his knees, McGuire crawled into the now smoke-filled, fully engaged apartment. Officer Lewis following right behind him, holding on to his ankles so that there would be a way out if they couldn't reach the man. Finally inside, blind from the smoke, from the heat, still not able to see where the man was, they simply began the process of padding around on the floor until they could touch something, and what they touched was another human being. They grabbed him and were able to pull him literally out of that fire, saving themselves and the resident. The gentleman was badly, badly injured. Second-degree burns over most of his body and a bad case of smoke inhalation. But he was alive, and he's alive today due to the quick thinking and heroic work of the officers Jeffrey Lewis and Christopher McGuire. Officer Michael McGinn. And I said we'd have one twice, and here it is. On May 10th, 2008, while on patrol in the area of State and Fillmore on St. Paul's West Side, Officer McGinn noticed large group of people and cars racing in the area. He noticed one vehicle in particular driving recklessly. Due to the amount of traffic, he couldn't pursue the vehicle and last saw it go through a red light at Plato and Robert. When he got through the traffic trying to catch up with him, he saw the reckless driver had crashed into a tree. But not just, this is not a low-speed crash. This is a high-speed collision with forces that tore the car in two. He rushed in to render aid to the victims, but 20 yards from the point of impact, he found half of the car. And the driver who had been thrown from the car, which was still smoking and now had gone into flame, was trapped underneath the car, and literally lying there on top of him was the block engine from his vehicle. Not just lying on his ankles, not just lying on his arm. This engine is lying on this man's head. Officer McGinn saw the victim laying there, saw that he was moving, and without any regard for his own safety, and I still can't believe that you were able to do this, picked up a 300-pound, now flaming engine in his bare hands, took it off of the man's head, and moved it aside. That man was taken to the hospital and survived, with the grace of God, with lacerations and a number of broken bones. Mike, I don't know how you got that engine off of his head. It is one of those things that they talk about the adrenaline when in times of crisis. That's the only thing I can attest that to. But it is with great honor that I give you your second life-saving award. Officer Michael McGinn. Officers Joshua Lino and Daniel Ficcadini, please come up. Now, Josh and Dan are two of our newer officers. They are legacy officers from the department. On July 1st, 2008, Officers Lino and Ficcadetti were flagged down by a male who said he heard someone screaming for help near the river, near the intersection of Shepherd Road and Jackson. They went down there and heard a distinct cry for help and discovered a man floating in the Mississippi. Since this was shortly after 0100 hours, it's 1 a.m., it's pitch black, impossible to see. They radioed for assistance and planned to enter the river when the individual started floating their way. They encouraged him to try and keep swimming, keep floating towards them. But it was a distance from the embankment to the river. No boat, no rope. They stretched out as far as they could into the water, holding on to each other, and were able to grab the man's arms. Now, this is another big guy. Too big for even these two to be able to pull him to shore safely. To add to the complications, the man had been so badly beaten that both of his eyes were swollen shut, and he couldn't see which way to help them. The frightened man hung on for dear life to them, and fortunately enough, very quickly, someone brought a rope and a leash to wrap around the victim, and he was finally brought to safety and transported to Regents Hospital for treatment of his injuries. Once again, I want you to imagine pitch black, the Mississippi River running fast. You don't have the right tools for the job, but the job has to get done. And Dan and Josh found a way to get it done. So with great honor, we award life-saving award to Officer Joshua Lino and Dan Ficcadetti. Ernest Hemingway once said that courage was grace under pressure. And I think that well describes the contributions of St. Paul's finest, and especially those who've been honored here today. The honorees' success is a key benchmark to St. Paul's commitment to our community. Their work has touched the lives, not just of the people they saved, but literally all of us. And it exemplifies the values that we hold dear. Values of commitment, values of compassion, and values of courage. I want to thank all of you for joining me today in recognizing these heroes. They are truly St. Paul's finest, and I am very proud to serve with them. Thank you.